So, The Brutalist is a film that wants very badly to be about the immigrant experience in the United States. I know that that's what it wants to be because that's largely how it's been marketed, how the filmmakers have talked about the film leading up to its release, and how Adrian Brody has talked about it in all of his award speeches thus far.
You know, this story is really, the character's journey is very reminiscent of my mother's and my ancestral journey of fleeing the horrors of war and coming to this great country.
So I suppose I admire that ambition, right? This is a time when the experience of the American immigrant is especially important to talk about, is especially present in all of our minds. And I would love to see a film that talks about it, even if it is historical and doesn't necessarily speak to the modern immigrant experience. I think it's still a story that is worth telling and that I would love to have seen. But I'll just cut right to the chase and tell you that this film did very little for me, ultimately. I spent much of its 3.5 hour runtime pretty much entirely unmoved by its austerity and its dourness and its repeated pleas for the audience to take it seriously and to see it as something very important. There's a lot of amazing craft here. It will no doubt win all sorts of awards for performances and cinematography and probably the score. I hope the score. So The Brutalist is about a Hungarian immigrant named Laszlo Toth, who escapes persecution, comes to the United States in the 40s in the wake of World War II to start a new life for himself. He's separated from his wife and the rest of his family, but seeks to start anew and to find a way to get his family to the States as well. When he gets to the United States, he meets up with a family member who owns a small furniture shop. Shop who owns a small furniture shop. And oh my God, that is so hard to say. Ugh, I hate this part. This is the hardest part, just describing a fucking plot. Okay. When he gets to the United States, he meets up with a family member who owns a small furniture store and begins working for him. Long story short, they eventually get a commission from this wealthy businessman to redo a room in his house, redo this library. Eventually, this businessman is so impressed with the work that he does that he sort of discovers him and enlists him to help with this passion project. So this eccentric millionaire guy is Harrison Van Buren, who is played by Guy Pearce. And really the movie is about this project, this weird passion project of this eccentric millionaire who wants to build this community center that is it's a chapel, it's a gym, it's a pool, it's a meeting space, and it's all in this weird, huge building that sits on top of a hill in a small town in Pennsylvania. And that's really what the movie is about. Ultimately, it is about the relationship between these two men, this strange project they're making, all of the different challenges that they face in finishing the project, and really, it's more about that relationship than it is about anything else. The fact that Laszlo is an immigrant, the fact that he is a Jewish man, really plays almost no role in the film, if I'm being honest. And that might be kind of a hot take, but it really doesn't. We'll get more into this later, but if Laszlo was Italian or if he was, I don't know, German, if he was from any other country, it really wouldn't change anything that's going on in this plot. The fact of his Hungarianness, his Jewishness, none of that plays any role whatsoever. In fact, Laszlo basically ends up being just kind of a stand-in, a catch-all stand-in for any and all immigrants to the United States. And that to me is kind of a lost opportunity. It doesn't really do anything to color this character. We don't really learn anything about these cultures. It really could be just about any European immigrant of the time period. And again, that's just sort of a shame. Again, when I talk more about the writing, we'll dig into that deeper. But it's hard to talk about the plot without just talking about that I don't feel like this film is really about the immigrant experience as much as it wants to be. So first, before we get into that, let's talk about performances. So obviously a lot will be said and already has been said about Adrian Brody's performance here. He is currently in the process of winning just about every single possible thing you can win for a performance. He's won everything and anything, and I think that's fine. Like, I think this is a fine performance. I like Adrian Brody generally. But is it the best performance of the year? Probably not for me, personally. So the first thing to say about this performance is that this is clearly a performance that is trying to win an Oscar. There's just no way around it. It is incredibly showy. I remember texting my partner like 30 minutes into the film that Adrian Brody had already wept uncontrollably like 3 times in the first 20 or 30 minutes of the film. Again, that's fine. Some stories call for that, but it feels incredibly Oscar baity. It feels like a lot of the film is designed to give Adrian Brody as many clips as possible for his Oscar reel as possible. So yeah, there's nothing you can really do to criticize this performance. There's nothing that comes off in any sort of negative way. It just, at the end of the day, lacks any real subtlety. So for me, it's not super exciting. I would much rather see more attention go to someone like Coleman Domingo, who does a lot more that's interesting to me than what Adrian Brody is doing here, which is really a standard by the book Oscar-y performance. There's also plenty that will be said about the fact that apparently AI was used in some way to help Adrian Brody with his accent. That apparently they went in post production and used some subtle trickery with AI to make his accent more authentic. I have mixed feelings on this. It's not something you're going to notice. It's not something that I think is movie breaking by any means, but there are a lot of people who think that that should be disqualifying, that if you're using something to enhance your performance in that way, maybe you shouldn't be winning an Oscar. It does feel like it is sort of like performance enhancing drugs. That being said, the Academy is not going to care. This video is probably going to come out after he's already won that Oscar, which is fine, and he's going to win that Oscar. I don't think that's anything that's going to catch on and is going to be something that is talked about beyond a few comments on Reddit. But I think it should be. I think there is a conversation that is worth having there. So make no mistake, this is really a performance for the Academy first and foremost. It doesn't feel like he is acting for the audience or for the plot or for anything like that. It really feels like Adrian Brody is acting directly to those Academy voters first and foremost. And that, to me, kept me at a distance from the performance a little bit. The more interesting performance here is actually probably Guy Pearce. I think he is more of a standout. He, of course, is playing the mysterious eccentric millionaire, which is kind of a tropey character, but I think he does a lot to elevate the role into something more interesting than it could have been. I think the film actually telegraphs a lot of what this character is going to do and prevents the character from being as unpredictable and weird and eccentric as I think it wanted it to be. But Guy Pearce is really able to create these moments where you're really not sure where his head is at, what his motivations are, what he's going to say next. And I think that's impressive when, like I said, I think the writing does not do him any favors here. And just in general, I hope that we get to see a little bit more of Guy Pearce, because I think he's really impressive here, and I'm surprised that his performance is not getting more attention. Don't get me wrong, I think Kieran Culkin's going to win supporting actor, and I think he probably should, but I think Guy Pearce deserves a lot of credit for what he's able to do here. And Felicity Jones is also here. She's here, and she's present, and she clocked in on time, and she did her very best, and that's really the most that I can really say about this performance. That being said, I don't really think it's her fault. I think this performance really kind of is let down by the writing at the end of the day. And while I'm not sold on what Felicity Jones does here, I don't know that anybody could have really saved the way that the female characters in this film are written. What Felicity Jones does a great job of here is crying and yelling and suffering and being in pain. And that, to me, is just not the most impressive type of performance, just like Adrian Brody. When you're just screaming and yelling and crying at me over and over again throughout a film, it just feels cheap. It feels like it's again awards bait. It feels less like it's about the good of the movie, the integrity of the message or the emotion you're trying to convey, and more about getting those awards, getting those accolades. And again, that might be more to do with direction, and I'd say that about Adrian Brody as well. But at the end of the day, didn't do a whole lot for me, unfortunately. All right, since I've already sort of foreshadowed what I'm going to talk about, let's use Felicity Jones's character as a segue here. So she plays Laszlo's wife, and she spends half of the film still in Hungary writing letters to Laszlo, talking about her experience there, about how much she misses her, or she misses him, all of those things. She eventually gets to the United States, not by her own doing, but because Laszlo meets a couple of very wealthy lawyers who pull some strings and get her shipped there, basically. When she arrives to the States, she also arrives with their niece, Zsofia, who is literally silent for most of the film. She is described as being ill in some way, but that's never really explained, and she is quite literally mute. She does not say a single word until one scene a little bit later in the film, but for most of the time she's on screen, she is not speaking whatsoever. For the bulk of the film, these two women, their every move is determined by the men around them. I don't think either of them make a single choice or a single decision in the entire film that was not directed by a man, where a man didn't say, you should go do this, and that's what they did. I don't think either of them ever accomplishes anything that a man does not get for them. For example, we're told that Laszlo's wife is a pretty successful journalist back in Budapest. And when she gets to the States, she ends up getting a job writing for a woman's magazine in the United States. How does she get that job? Harrison gets it for her. The wealthy businessman finds this job for her, puts her in the job basically using his connections. So she doesn't get it herself. We're never told if she's like doing a good job or if anyone's impressed with what she's doing. She's just given this job and she just does it. I don't even think we ever see her at the job. We just are told she has a job. And that's it. Zsofia, the niece, seems to exist really just to be the caretaker of Mrs. Toth. Something that I neglected to mention is that both of these women are actually mentioned as being ill in some way. So, Felicity Jones, her character, is in a wheelchair for most of the film. It's never really explained exactly what's happening. They say it's osteoporosis for some reason as a result of the famine. And it generally seems to make her very weak. She has these bouts of very powerful pain at night and has to take very powerful medication. And that's really it. And I think if you're someone who is really into disability studies or anything like that, there is a lot to be said here about the ways that these two women's disabilities, which are really vague and never fully explained, just kind of act as plot devices. They are just ways to add more of a struggle for Laszlo. Everything about these characters exists to create more conflict for the men in the film. Zsofia in particular really just exists for men in the film to abuse her. I don't think there's anything else she accomplishes other than being someone who these wealthy men pick on and abuse and treat terribly. Meanwhile, Felicity Jones is really just there to be at home, to be someone who is upset at Laszlo, to be someone who kind of scolds Laszlo when he starts to get a little too obsessed with his project. And then there's a smaller female character that I don't even know her name, but Guy Pearce's character, Harrison, has a pair of twin children. They're probably both in their 20s. Now, the male, his son, actually plays a pretty important role throughout. He's kind of this Donald Trump Jr. sort of figure. He is very conniving and does a lot of really terrible things, and but he's an important character. He does a lot to move the plot forward. Now, his sister does nothing the entire film. This is a character that has 4 lines maybe in the entire film. She has no personality. She doesn't participate in the business. She doesn't participate in anything. She has absolutely nothing to do in this film. And that's just another example of the ways that women in this film are totally underutilized and have, again, nothing to do. And let me be clear, the film isn't doing anything with that. This is not something the film is trying to say. This is just poor writing or lazy writing. This is not a statement about feminism in the 1940s. This is just an oversight. So beyond its depiction of women, I have some other gripes with the writing here. So one is a problem that I think a lot of films I didn't like this year share, which is that it's a little overstuffed. Obviously, the film is 3.5 hours long. And I think that will be talked about by a lot of people. A lot of people will cite that as the reason that they're not seeing the film, which I get. I totally understand. But for me, that's really not the issue. Like, I am very much in favor of a film being however long it needs to be to get its point across, right? If it needs to be 4 hours long, if it needs to be 5 hours long, go for it. I'm not concerned about that. The issue is that I don't know if this film justifies that length. There are a lot of times where it feels like there is a particular setback in the plot for the characters that felt really unnecessary, didn't really add anything, and really just felt like they were actually trying to get to that kind of inflated 3.5 hour mark. There's literally an actual intermission in the middle of the film, and it feels like they really wanted that they thought that was cool and old timey. And so, yeah, there's a lot of things in here where it's like, yeah, this shot doesn't need to be an extra 10 seconds long. This scene doesn't need to have this long, drawn out shot of whatever. It does feel like it's trying to get to that point more than it needs to get to that point, to that length. And because it's so long and because it's so overstuffed, it does feel like, well, let me stop myself because I was going to say that it doesn't know what it wants to be. I think it absolutely does know what it wants to be, but I don't know that it gets there because it's also doing a lot of other things. There are so many side plots and side things happening in this film that this idea of being a film about the immigrant experience and this big epic about making it in America and pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, I think it really falls to the wayside because it's trying to pack so much other stuff in this film. So, for example, this film has a whole plot about addiction. It has a whole subplot about the relationship between Laszlo and his wife. It has a lot of recurring themes of like sexuality, the role that sex plays in relationships. What this movie ultimately is about is not really about that immigrant experience stuff. It's really about the relationship between these two men. It's about power dynamics. I think it's a lot more about poverty than it is about immigration ultimately, because the ways that Guy Pearce's character exploits Laszlo, the way that he mistreats him, uses his labor, all of these things. Again, it could be any poor person. It could be any poor artist who's very talented, whose labor is being exploited because they're desperate and they need this money. They need this support from this wealthy man who is treating him like shit in exchange. And the other thing that's kind of a disappointment to me is that one thing this film is absolutely not about, which I found very surprising, was architecture. So the fact that Laszlo is an architect plays almost no role in this film, which I thought was kind of disappointing. There is one scene I will say that is probably my favorite piece of dialogue in the whole film, maybe my favorite scene in the whole film, that is between Laszlo and Harrison. They're in this diner, and Harrison is presenting Laszlo with his own portfolio, with Laszlo's portfolio of work from Hungary. And the point is, he's revealing himself as now knowing who Laszlo is and saying, you know, oh my God, you're actually really talented. You've made all these amazing buildings. What are you doing just working construction or mining coal or whatever it is? And then at some point in this scene, he asks Laszlo, you know, why architecture? Why is that the thing that you chose? And it's very brief. Laszlo's response is very brief. It's like 2 sentences, but it is my favorite line in the whole film. And that was really beautiful. And I'm thinking in my head, okay, cool. So that's going to be elaborated throughout the film. We're going to see more of that. We're going to see why that is the case. And I'm not saying it because I don't want to spoil it, but we're going to see more of that. And we just don't. I'm sure you can take a reading of it that like we do see that. Maybe it's in there somewhere, but not enough is done with it, I don't think. It's just not elaborated enough for me, which I think was a lost opportunity again. And again, this is an example of if you replaced this particular part of this character with something else, if he wasn't an architect and instead he was a portrait artist or instead he was a filmmaker or something, it would change virtually nothing about this film. It's not a big part of what this film is ultimately about. If you know about brutalism, and the point of brutalism and why brutalism was popular at the time and in Europe and all of that, there's a lot to be said there. It's really interesting. And I also think brutalism is really cool. Like, I love some of the architecture that's shown in this film, the little of it that we do see. So before I get into what really kind of killed my excitement for this film, let's talk about some of the good things. Let's go back a little bit and talk about what does work. So first, cinematography. I think this is a visually beautiful film, obviously. Especially when we get into the shots of architecture. When this building does start to come together towards the end of the film, I love the way that it's shot from the inside, the way that it is beautiful and really cool and futuristic, but also a little claustrophobic. It's very dark and gray and very confining, which I think is interesting and I think is something that, again, could have been a recurring thing throughout the film if the plot would have gotten there sooner, because we don't see it till the last 30 minutes or so. Also, there's this recurring motif that I really like, where there is like a first-person perspective on some sort of vehicle. We're in a vehicle, we see a road in front of us or a railroad in front of us if it's a train. We're moving very, very fast. We see the road in front of us, we don't see where it's going. And that's like this recurring thing that comes up a lot. It's a car, it's a train, it's even, I think, a walking path a couple times. It's just traveling. And I think that says so much more about the themes of this film, does a better job of communicating those themes than anything else in this film does. And I think that is both an amazing thing when it comes to how good the cinematography is, but also a big example of why the movie for me ultimately fails, because the writing is not able to do what just the cinematography is able to do. Also, the score in this film is great. I think the score is a little Oscar baity. It feels really similar to other scores for films that this film, I think, is drawing inspiration from. I kept thinking of the Johnny Greenwood score to There Will Be Blood. It is really beautiful at times. It's really discordant and abrasive and painful to listen to at times for good reason. And all of that is over shots of like construction and men yelling at other men and industry. And, so it's the score is, I think, saying a really similar thing. But I think it's beautiful. I think it works really well overall. And if it won Best Score, I'd be fine with that because I think it's great. So, all of this amazing craft that I'm talking about, the disappointment here is that I feel like it is really bogged down by this film's relentless austerity, its relentless self seriousness. It feels like at every moment, the film is screaming at you to take it seriously, that it's begging you to see this as something important, right? Whether it's the over the top performances or the really just drab color palette. Whether it's the fact that, the film seems insistent on just putting the main character Laszlo through as much pain and turmoil as it possibly can, just kind of for the sake of it. Whether it's these like title cards that say part 1, part 2, intermission, there is an epilogue that's literally labeled as an epilogue. These things that, again, just feel like they are telegraphing to the audience that this is a film you are meant to take seriously and you better take seriously. And I think ultimately that cheapens a lot of the work here. I don't want to be told how to feel about a film. I want to come to my own conclusions. I want the film to speak for itself. But it does seem like that shouting has worked because this film is getting pretty much unanimous universal praise and acclaim, which is kind of surprising to me because I think a lot of what's in this film is really similar to recent Oscar contending films that have pissed off a lot of reviewers and a lot of viewers. Things like The Green Book, for example. Like, this feels like one of those types of films. It feels like a bunch of liberal Hollywood types who are well-meaning, but who are making this thing about the immigrant experience that does nothing to actually talk about what makes that experience unique. It does nothing to talk about the specificity of Hungary, the specificity of being a Jewish immigrant in the 40s, and instead just generalizes the entire immigrant experience as if it's all the same. The ending to the film is annoyingly neat and tidy. We have this epilogue, like I said, that basically just wraps everything up in it and ties a nice little bow on it. And I feel like that also cheapened anything this film could have said. And it does that especially because all of the achievements that these characters make, they don't actually make on their own. And I get the point of like this wealthy man gives them everything that they want, but then ultimately exploits them. But the film is robbed of any of the poignancy of that because ultimately, they do get everything they want. Ultimately, all of their achievements come from another guy giving it to them. It never felt to me like Laszlo earned his success. It felt like it came from a wealthy benefactor giving him money, giving him free housing, which is just a major lost opportunity. That final scene is like the worst thing in the whole movie to me because there is a character who all but looks directly into the camera and just tells you exactly what the film wants you to think about it. It just says the themes to you so that you don't have to do any thinking yourself. It's just going to tell you what this has all been about. And again, super disappointing and really weak, lazy writing. I don't need that to be explained to me, or at least I shouldn't need that to be explained to me. But unfortunately, I kind of did need that to be explained to me. When this character explains what this building is about, why it was built this way, why it was important to Laszlo that different things were included in it, I just found myself thinking like, oh, that's a surprise. The film never gives you any of that until it literally just tells you at the last second. It feels like this film completely forgets that it's even about immigration or the immigrant experience or all of those different things until the last 30 minutes. And then it's like, oh shit, we're supposed to be about immigration. We're supposed to be about this immigrant. We got to throw all that stuff in there. There's another scene towards the end that does the same thing where Laszlo's in a car with his wife, they're driving, and all of a sudden he has this emotional monologue about how these people don't want us here and they don't see us as real people and all of these things, which feels like it comes completely out of nowhere to me because nowhere in this film do we really see him being discriminated against. Most of the people in the film who are not Guy Pearce actually treat him pretty well, honestly, and kind of treat him as equal or as an equal. And so this whole monologue about people not wanting them there, not treating them like a human, we don't see any of that. That's not something that we're shown, it's something we're told. And that to me felt really that's the weakest point in the entire film to me. And again, I don't need to see an immigrant discriminated against. I mean, that doesn't need to be what this movie's even about, but it's what the movie really wants to be about. It's what a lot of the pathos, a lot of the emotional payoff is supposed to be, and it just is not there for me at all. Ultimately, I'm left wondering, what am I supposed to be taking from this? What is the message that is being delivered here? Because this is not a movie about a man overcoming struggle to achieve something all on his own. It is a movie about a man who was handed a ton of money, who was handed a ton of privilege and a ton of help, and manages to succeed. Shouldn't even say manages. He succeeds because he has a ton of money. Am I supposed to take from this film that, like, as long as you that all you need to do as an immigrant is find a wealthy white man to pay for all of your things, and you'll be fine? That's not super compelling. Is it supposed to be a, pulling on the bootstraps type of thing? Because I don't really feel like Laszlo does that. I mean, he works very hard, but he works very hard out of necessity. He doesn't really find any success on his own. So that's not really connecting with me either, especially when all the other immigrant characters in the film also don't achieve anything on their own at all. The film seems to want us to feel this profound sympathy or maybe to identify with these characters, to feel uplifted by their overcoming of their struggle and all of these things, but it kind of forgets to give us a character to sympathize with, to give us characters who are fully formed, who have eccentricities and specificities and things to color their character beyond just immigrant, sad immigrant. That is really what Adrian Brody's character is. And, his family is even more empty. They just kind of exist as props in his life as opposed to characters who are dealing with their own problems or overcoming their own struggles. I can't say enough how frustrating it is that the fact that he is Hungarian, the fact that he is Jewish, means nothing to the plot of this film. He could have been from anywhere and it would have been the exact same film. But ultimately, what we're left with is a film that gives its actors some moments for really cool monologues, but ultimately left me as cold as Brutalist concrete. It left me feeling nothing. It did nothing to teach me about these cultures. It did nothing to show, the strength of the American immigrant. It did very little than create a formulaic film that is designed to garner as many nominations at the Oscars as possible. And I just think we ought to expect better and we deserve better from our Oscar bait melodramas. There's some moments in here that are cool. There's some great cinematography, but I think at the end of the day, a film is always going to come down to the writing, and the writing just lets this whole thing down. It doesn't, like I said, it doesn't get there for me. And I think there are much more worthy films coming out at the Oscars. Let's go Anora for Best Picture, because if it's The Brutalist, I think that will be massively disappointing. So thank you for listening to me talk for a little bit, and I'll see you next time. Furniture shop